This series is based upon and inspired by the 2021 series Squid Game, created by Hwang Dong-hyuk and produced by Netflix. It also features art created by the fabulous Andrew MacLaine. Steve, player 98, looks blankly up to Diane, player 96, and she practically drags him to his feet as the other team walk ahead towards the red door. With a sound of worry, Mary, player 95, asks if Steve is okay. Diane shoots him a knowing look, and after a deep breath, he responds to Mary that he'll be okay. After entering the room, Mary, Diane, Steve, and player 101, the middle-aged woman with a choppy blonde mullet, head towards the blue side and inspect the boxes and podiums, whilst the other team examine those on the orange side. Yet unlike some previous groups, they obey the signs and refrain from touching the contents of the boxes. Diane is soon captivated by a large pink horizontal smudge which is spread along the side wall and seems to be dripping pink liquid. Noticing player 101 standing to her side, Diane grimaces at this smudge and gasps that this is some disgusting cleaner fluid. Player 101 listens as Diane comments how she would hate to work as a cleaner, not only because of dealing with mess and stuff, but also due to all the repulsive products they have to use, adding that most mornings she can smell her family's maid before she's even walked through the front door. Diane then notices the unimpressed glare of player 101, who responds that she has had honest work as a cleaner for 15 years now. Diane's jaw drops a little, and she attempts to explain herself, but player 101 walks away without another word. After witnessing this conversation, Steve gulps in second-hand embarrassment and turns back around. Mary feels her hand along the wall and asks if he is all right. But after hearing only his slow, deep breaths follow, she asks him to describe the room, which he gradually begins to do so. Meanwhile, the other team are discussing the contents of the boxes on their side of the room. However, player 94, the young man with ashy skin and morose lips, soon moves away and retches quietly against the corner, to the disgust of his teammates. Just then, Miss Green's voice sounds from the speakers, ordering players 89, Lisa, 91, Keith, 92, the older woman with a pointed nose, and 94 to the blue side of the room, and players 95, Mary, 96, Diane, 98, Steve, and 101 to the orange side. These are in fact the opposite sides to where the two teams are currently gathered. Some players are clearly a little confused, including Keith, who protests that both sides are the same. Silence follows until Miss Green repeats this instruction in a more forceful tone. Keith appears willing to obey her, but player 94 turns back into the corner and asks what is the point when they are all going to die anyway. Miss Green's voice increases in volume from the screens, this time shouting to player 94 that she will have him and his team killed now if he does not cooperate. This seems to worry player 94's teammates, and Lisa begs him to do as they are asked. As Mary, Diane, Steve, and player 101 slowly cross to the orange side of the room, Lisa continues to beg player 94. When Miss Green issues a final warning, he snarls at Lisa and stomps to the blue side of the room, swiftly followed by the rest of his team. Once they are together by the boxes, Keith says, "Chin up," to player 94, and whispers how one of that bunch can't see. Upon hearing this comment, Mary turns towards Keith and shoots a pointed smile, which leaves him appearing somewhat confused. Meanwhile, Diane is leaning against the orange side's wall and staring at the contents of the boxes. Steve begins to examine the blocks inside as well, until he notices Diane. He gives her a tentative grin and slight nod of support. With a hint of curiosity in her eyes, Diane gazes to Steve for a few seconds, and he awkwardly looks away, at which point she narrows her eyes and tells him that he actually has quite a nice smile. He turns back to Diane with an unexpected frown, and seems unsure of how to reply to this comment, but she walks past to the building square. Miss Green finally continues her instructions, announcing that for this game, players have 2 minutes to build a tower from the blocks provided. A mixture of reactions ensue, and she casually informs how the team with the bigger tower will win, whilst the team with the smaller tower will be eliminated. As most players approach their respective boxes, Miss Green recites the following rules. Each player must use only the box from their side of the room. Each player must build their tower on the building square provided. Each player must not lift the boxes from the podiums. Each player must not make physical contact with another player. Each player must stand still when the game ends. Following this announcement, Miss Green asks if there are any questions, but she is met by an overwhelmed silence. She then declares that this game will begin in 3, 2, 1. The timer suddenly counts down from 2 minutes. On the orange side of the room, player 101 immediately dives her hands into the middle box of yellow blocks, before pointing to the left box with the larger red blocks and shouting at Steve to start on these. While they start tossing these blocks towards their building square, Mary struggles to feel her way towards the blocks with the small green blocks. Diane still seems dazed, yet races ahead from the wall and calls Mary over. They then toss the green blocks in the general direction of the building square. Once Steve has thrown out all the larger red blocks, player 101 shouts that she will put them on the building square and tells him to take out the remaining yellow blocks. Steve appears surprised by the speed of player 101's orders, but dutifully does what she asks. However, as he pulls out the remaining yellow blocks, he soon notices that Diane is struggling to remove the green blocks as quickly as Mary. After chipping her fingernail on a block, Diane gasps and looks round to the blue team. Although player 94 is gritting his teeth with tears in his eyes, and Keith is only using his left hand, they are hastily chucking the yellow blocks towards their building square, which Lisa and player 92 are building upon at a much faster rate than the orange team. Diane soon becomes distracted by this sight and stops moving the green blocks. Mary taps on the box and shouts to get her head into the game. Diane looks ready to say something, but proceeds to do as Mary orders. Whilst player 101 is placing the 8th of the 10 red blocks onto the building square, she notices that the blue team are already placing their yellow blocks on top of their 10 red blocks. Steve carries over the last of the yellow blocks, and player 101 places the rest of the red blocks on top of their tower. The timer hits 1 minute 36, and Mary restlessly looks round, then asks Diane where the building square is. Without speaking, Diane grabs Mary's arm and pulls her ahead. This seems to annoy her, but she allows herself to be dragged to the building square. Mary drops a handful of green blocks by player 101 and runs back to grab more. While Steve follows her, player 101 and Diane begin to place the yellow blocks on top of their tower. For the next 10 seconds, Steve and Mary throw over as many green blocks as they can. Diane and player 101 continue building their tower, although it is still smaller than that of the blue team. However, when the timer passes 1 minute 23, Diane glances up to the blue team's tower and watches a vertical crack suddenly form on a lower red block. She whispers this to player 101, but before she can respond, Steve rushes in and states that there's a crack in their tower as well. Diane's eyes widen, and player 101 scurries around to the side of their tower which faces the boxes, to see that there is indeed a crack forming on a lower red block. Steve looks carefully to the tower for a few moments, then informs how the yellow blocks must be too heavy to go on the reds. A second later, a loud cracking sound is heard from the blue team's tower. As it proceeds to crash to the ground, Diane briefly looks elated, and Mary demands to know what this sound was, until she hears the anger and hysteria sounding from the blue team. Mary lets out a sigh of relief, and Steve uses both hands to signal the top and bottom of his team's tower, then tells Diane and player 101 to swap it around. Diane asks if he is sure, but he simply responds to trust him, as he's a builder. On the blue side of the room, player 92 berates player 94 for having put too many blocks on top, and Lisa tries to maintain order between them. Keith is carefully watching player 101 and Steve as they put down the yellow blocks onto the building square. Mary goes to grab more green blocks, at which point Keith turns to the others on the blue team and whispers that he has an idea. Within a few seconds, Keith and his teammates are cramming as many green and yellow blocks, although mainly the former, into the hollow interiors of their larger red blocks. During this time, the orange team are grabbing more yellow blocks, which Steve says they need to put down before the red blocks go on top. Mary frantically feels around the floor for more blocks, although when she moves close enough to the blue side, she overhears Keith whispering that the red blocks need to be heavy as lead. With piles of green and yellow blocks in her hands, Mary freezes and frowns in the direction of player 92, who seems to realise that Mary has heard what they are planning. Player 2 screeches at her team to get on with it. The blue team get to their feet, and Mary twists back to her team, shouting at them to watch out. With 1 minute 8 remaining, the blue team run towards the dividing line with their heavily crammed red blocks. Player 101 and Steve dart around, and Diane finds herself diving behind their tower for shelter. When Mary hears the blue team's loud, heavy footsteps approaching the dividing line, she launches all the yellow and green blocks in her hands towards the other side of the room, then turns and covers her hands over her face. Player 92 jumps to the side to avoid one of the blocks that Mary has just thrown, but she lands on her ankle and howls as she falls to the floor. At the same time, player 94 steps onto a yellow block and slides ahead, yelling in pain until he falls back and smacks the back of his head against the floor. However, Keith manages to avoid these blocks, and a second later, He throws his red blocks straight towards the orange team's tower. Steve tries to jump in front, but is not fast enough to shield the tower. Although some of the smaller blocks fall out, Keith's red block is still packed heavily enough by the time it makes impact that it causes the orange team's tower to shudder back. A split second later, Lisa throws a block, which hits the side of player 101's head and causes her to fall back towards the orange team's tower. She tries to stop herself, but their tower crumbles to the floor beneath her. With 56 seconds left, player 92 is moaning and gripping her ankle in pain on the other side of the room, while Keith and Lisa are excitedly placing down yellow blocks onto their building square. Diane shouts vicious abuse at them, and for a few seconds Steve is clearly shaken. However, after widening his eyes and letting out a quick breath, he jumps back up to his feet and orders Diane not to waste her breath. He then runs to help up player 101, who is continually apologising, but he firmly orders her not to worry and to carry on. Whilst Diane and player 101 begin to regather their yellow blocks, Steve looks up to see Mary shaking as she grips onto the middle box. He calls her name, but when he receives no reply, he runs over and urges how there is no time like the present. The orange team gather and pile on yellow blocks to their building square, but after just a few seconds, Steve notices that Diane is no longer helping, yet staring intently at the blue team's tower. He asks what is wrong and chivies her to keep going, when she releases a calculated smile. With 46 seconds remaining, Diane crouches down next to Steve and whispers that the intercom woman said all those rules at the start. Steve seems more focused on putting the yellow blocks on the building square and impatiently asks, "So what?" Mary drops more yellow blocks nearby, and over the hubbub of the blue team, she hears Diane state how the woman never forbade them from crossing the line into the other team's side. Steve stops and looks to their opponent's tower, which is already bigger. With a grin, Diane whispers that they can knock down the blue's tower without breaking any rules. Player 101 appears to wait for a response from Steve. He turns towards the blue side of the room and notices the toes of player 94's unconscious body flinching just over the line. He lets out a gradual nod, then whispers, "Fuck it, okay." Mary crawls around and offers to defend their tower, as the other team will probably retaliate. Player 101 looks hesitantly to Mary after hearing the suggestion, but swiftly continues to add blocks to the top of their tower. Steve nods, and Mary asks how much time is left, to which Diane hastily replies that there are 37 seconds left. Mary tells Steve to go now, and he manages a hopeful smile to Diane, who gulps and subtly gets to her feet, then nods back. A second later, Steve and Diane charge across the dividing room, into the blue side of the room, past player 94, whose head is now emanating a puddle of blood. Player 92 jolts round and screams at her teammates to watch out. Lisa and Keith turn to see Diane and Steve sprinting towards their tower, and Miss Green shouts through the speakers that this is not allowed, but they continue to charge ahead. Lisa jumps up and sprints to Diane, who tries to dodge, yet Lisa manages to grab her waist and pulls her down to her knees. During this time, Keith tackles Steve next to the building square. Steve tries to break free from Keith, who grips tightly onto his chest as the timer hits 31 seconds. Lisa struggles to restrain Diane, who scratches and growls at her to fuck off, whilst player 92 hobbles over and tries to help her fight Diane. Steve then jabs his elbow back into Keith's stomach and punches his injured arm, which causes him to shout in pain. Player 92 notices Steve scrambling up to his knees right next to her team's tower. She swerves back and tries to stop Steve, but he pushes past her with ease. He then leans over and rips up the blue team's tower from its base, launching its blocks towards the wall. With 24 seconds remaining, Miss Green announces over the speakers that this is not allowed. Keith miserably shouts at Steve to put their tower back up, and Lisa screams how this is not fair, but Diane butts the back of her head into Lisa's face with enough force to silence her and wriggle free. Player 92 swears and limps ahead towards the orange team's tower, which Mary is still defending. Diane gets up, chases player 92, and tackles her from behind, which sees her land next to player 94. Keith angrily charges to the orange team's tower until he is tackled by Steve from behind. As the men grapple and grunt at each other upon the dividing line, Diane continues to hold player 92 to the floor. Lisa suddenly sprints round Diane, who shouts a warning to her teammates. Mary braces herself and forms fists with her hands as Lisa runs in towards the side of the orange team's tower. Miss Green shouts that the game will need to be stopped, although over this sound, Mary hears Lisa running towards her. When the timer hits 16 seconds, Mary turns towards Lisa, jumps into the air, and kicks her left foot ahead, which strikes Lisa's neck. She falls back against the floor and struggles for breath as Mary rebalances herself next to the tower. At this time, Player 101 is still placing yellow blocks upon the other side of their tower, which now stands at almost a metre high. However, with 12 seconds remaining on the timer, she hears a cracking on the tower's other side. She hurries round to inspect this sound, inadvertently turning her back to the rest of the room. While Steve continues to hold Keith to the floor, Diane is stood on the dividing line, watching her team's tower. She therefore does not notice Player 92 stirring just behind her. Player 92 suddenly gets up and runs towards Diane. She turns round to this sound in the nick of time, but Player 92 jabs 2 fingers against her windpipe. As Diane splutters for breath, Player 92 carefully treads her way over the scattered blocks to the orange team's tower, which Player 101 is still constructing, oblivious to Player 92's impending approach. Despite the scattered sounds of chaos around the room, Mary hears Player 92's footsteps before her and tenses in this direction. Player 92 narrows her eyes towards Mary, then throws a block to the side. Over the ongoing sound of Diane's painful spluttering for breath, the block Player 92 threw can be heard clattering against the side wall. With 6 seconds left, Mary scrambles off in this direction, and Player 92 jumps over, then yanks back on Player 101's mullet. She screams and falls back onto a pile of discarded blocks, next to Steve, who is still preoccupied with holding Keith down. After glancing back to see that Lisa has placed a few red blocks onto the blue team's building square, Player 92 grins and leads down towards the base of the orange team's tower. Mary frowns by the room's double door, then gasps and turns to run back, but trips on another block. Yet just as Player 92 is about to rip up the orange team's tower, Diane charges in from behind, grabs her by the neck, and tackles her to the side. Diane jumps on top of Player 92, who screams for help from the rest of her team. However, none of them pay her any attention, and Diane wraps her hand around Player 92's neck, silencing all subsequent noise except for a crackling choke for breath. The timer hits 0, and Steve finally lets go of Keith. He pushes Steve away, furiously objecting that the other team have to be eliminated, as they have cheated. The blue team's tower now stands at just under half a metre, whereas that of the orange team is over double this height. Through deep, exhausted breaths, Player 101 gasps that they won, and Steve lets out a weakened smile until he watches Lisa get to her feet with a tear-filled scowl. Diane is still strangling Player 92, whose pointed face is now turning a dark red. Mary crawls up behind and feels a hand towards Diane's shoulder. She twists round, and Mary calmly informs she can stop now. Diane continues to grip Player 92's neck and stares down into her helpless grey eyes. Still in a daze, Diane blankly turns to Mary, who informs that they have won, before carefully removing Diane's hands from Player 92's neck. Over the sounds of Lisa and Keith's frantic complaints, Diane leans back on her hands and her breathing accelerates. Mary places a hand on Diane's arm, and although she initially flinches, her breathing gradually returns to normal. The circle guard then enters through the door which players originally entered. Keith seems relieved and hurries to complain about how he believes the orange team cheated until the guard shoots him through the head. Steve quietly swears with widened eyes and shuffles back along the floor. Diane gasps and instinctively grips onto Mary's arm, although Mary whispers to stay still. Lisa lets out a delayed shriek, then runs towards the door beneath the gallery. The guard sprays a flurry of bullets into her back, and she falls against the wall with a bloody thud. He proceeds to shoot Player 94 before turning towards Player 92, who is still spluttering for breath next to Mary and Diane. Player 92 gasps for help and reaches a frail hand towards Mary. Diane watches in bewilderment until the guard shoots Player 92 through the heart. Diane wipes the splattered blood from her neck and finally removes her other hand from Mary's arm. The guard then orders Steve, Mary, Diane, and Player 101 to leave the room with him through the door beneath the gallery. The 4 players on this team appear equally shell-shocked and take over a minute to leave the room. When the room is finally clear, the 5 circle guards re-enter. Whilst they begin to remove the bodies of the eliminated players and restore the room to its original state, Square Guard's voice is heard from the speakers, telling them to take their time as they are on a break-up here. In the gallery, Miss Green is already sat in the armchair by the wall, turning away from the other triangle guards with a hand to her mask. After adjusting a few of the controls, Square Guard tells the triangle guards to help themselves to a drink from the bar at the back of the room. Yet as they stand, he beckons Miss Green over. She sheepishly approaches and says she is sorry. She pleads not to be judged based solely on this game, until Square Guard interrupts that although her earlier game did not have enough rules, this one had far too many, most of which she failed to follow. Miss Green emits a sound of anguish. Squareguard states how she cannot change the 2 games which have already happened, but she still has the power to impress him with her third. Miss Green nods, and with a silent sigh of relief, turns to sit back down in her armchair. Squareguard turns to Miss Purple and watches as she pours herself a drink from the bar. A few minutes later, the screen in the canteen shows the number of remaining players drop from 82 to 78, with the prize fund only jumping £100,000 to £9,500,000. For the next 20 minutes, Helen, player 22, and Alan, player 23, quietly discuss their least favourite foods and smells. The front row of players is then ordered to stand for their game, and Helen is distracted by a flurry of hysterical laughter from player 87, a middle-aged woman with unbalanced eyes. As Helen watches the guards herding player 87 and her team forward, Tracy, player 26, whispers to Alan that he will be playing against his new friend. Alan frowns, but Tracy gives him a knowing look, then discreetly gestures to Helen and the other players on this half of the row. The next 8 players walk through the door, and quietened conversations recommence within the canteen. Helen continues speaking to Alan, but he begins to show her less attention. This seems to confuse her, and within minutes she feels her migraine worsening. She turns and attempts to talk with player 21, the tall young man with spiky black hair, although he also gives little conversation in return. 4 more games follow, resulting in the number of players decreasing to 62, and the prize fund increasing to £10,200,000. Eventually, the next row, consisting of player 18, the short skin-headed man, player 19, the pretty young woman with a blonde bob, player 21, the tall young man with spiky black hair, player 22, Helen, player 23, Alan, player 26, Tracy, player 28, Yusuf, and player 32, the young woman with bushy peroxide bangs, are called forward. The 8 players approach the red door, and Alan walks slowly within the back of this group until Helen links her arm with his. She says not to worry, as she is nervous too. Alan appears unsure of how to react, but finds himself offering her a weak smile. Once they are in the game room, players 18, 19 and 21 move together to the blue side, whilst Helen joins Alan, Tracy, Yusuf and player 32 on the orange side. Tracy, Alan and Helen examine the contents of the boxes, and Yusuf reluctantly introduces himself, Tracy and Alan to player 32, who gives her name as Carol. Helen introduces herself as well to Carol, player 32, who frowns and asks if she is not on the other team. Helen looks unfavourably towards the others and winces, but Carol shrugs and jokingly assures how it doesn't matter, then gestures to Helen's pink hair and chuckles that she wishes she could pull this off. With Squareguard making notes to his side, Mr. Orange watches this scene intently from behind the control table. When he appears ready, he takes the microphone and welcomes the players, before announcing which sides of the room they must each report to. This prompts Helen to walk to the blue side. Within the gallery, Mrs. Blue comments how this tragic lass should have ditched that wretched Mohican in 1982. After approaching her teammates, Helen asks their names. Player 18 and 19 introduce themselves as Terry and Sarah, respectively. Helen gives her own name and looks towards player 21, but he is too focused on the contents of the boxes to listen. Mr. Orange then welcomes the players to Game 2, Block Towers. Before anyone can react, it is announced that each team must construct a tower on their building square. As player 21 smiles to himself, Mr. Orange continues how after 2 minutes, the team with the bigger tower will survive, and the team with the smaller tower will die. After a quiet pause in the room below, Mr. Orange concludes that these are the only rules. Although Mrs. Blue cocks her head in confusion, Mr. Yellow excitedly leans forward. Squareguard quietly asks Mr. Orange if he is certain, but he turns off the microphone and answers that he thinks this bunch will give the best game so far. Squareguard nods, and as they watch the Orange team conferring in the room below, Mr. Orange asks back into the microphone if anyone has any questions. Yusuf asks in a bewildered tone if they are really expected to play with Lego. Following a brief pause, Mr. Orange answers, "Fuck yes." Some players exchange confused glances, and Mr. Orange asks if they are ready. A few quiet nods and affirmative utterances are given, then Mr. Orange asks the question again, as if he is expecting a stronger reaction. Tracy looks strangely towards Yusuf, and Sarah, player 19, rolls her eyes, but most players exclaim the word yes at a louder volume, with Terry, player 18, shouting the loudest. Mr. Orange then tells them that their fight for survival starts in 3, 2, 1. All players hurry to their nearest boxes and start pulling out the different blocks. Within seconds, Sarah and Tracy are placing the large red blocks onto their team's respective building squares. However, when only 14 seconds of the game have passed, player 21 grabs a handful of the small green blocks and tells Sarah to stop. She does as he asks and peers up, with Terry and Helen also looking over from the middle box. Whilst the orange team continue emptying their boxes and piling the red blocks onto their building square, player 21 curiously states that these green blocks are heavier than he thought they'd be. He asks Sarah how heavy the red blocks are, and upon picking up the top one with ease, she replies, light as a feather. Player 21 runs over to the middle box of yellow blocks, scoops up a handful, and says that the smaller greens need to go on the bottom. Sarah and Terry express their agreements to player 21's plan. Stood to the side, Helen simply screws up her eyes in pain and feels her head. The timer passes 1 minute 35, and player 21 places down some green blocks on the building square, in a rectangular shape of 2 by 4 blocks, which he claims will be wide enough to support the yellow blocks on top. In the gallery, Miss Purple asks how he figured that out so quickly. Mr. Yellow takes the booklet of players, and upon reaching player 21's page, relays that he has an honours degree in construction. At the control table, Mr. Orange jokes how he has not put this degree to good use if he's ended up here. Mrs. Blue responds, however, that his degree could be extremely useful right now. Reading on through player 21's page, Mr. Yellow lets out a sound of curiosity and informs how this makes him one of just 4 players who went to boarding school. Mr. Orange scoffs that Mummy and Daddy can't save him now. Mr. Yellow shakes his head and responds that they cut him off last year, although he would be curious to see the look on their faces if they could see their son right now. Tracy watches her opponents placing their green blocks down first, and she seems confused by their change in strategy. Player 21 turns to Helen and shouts to help. She slowly looks up and apologises as she jogs over to this box, then grabs a handful of green blocks and returns to the tower. Helen tries to place them on top, but Sarah exhales in annoyance when her hand gets in the way, and player 21 orders her to grab more green blocks instead. Meanwhile, in the orange side of the room, Yusuf, Alan and Carol are placing yellow blocks onto the red blocks, which are already on their building square. Tracy is still helping, but seems more focused on the blue team. Yusuf notices and frantically asks why she has slowed down. Tracy runs to the green box, picks up a handful of these blocks, and replies how they might be too heavy to go on top. Alan asks what Tracy means, but she creeps towards them with a handful of these green blocks and whispers that they need to copy what the blue team are doing. Alan responds how these blocks are smaller, and so surely they must go on top. Tracy thrusts a green block into his hand, and as he appears to sense its weight, she explains that their tower will break if they put all the green blocks on top. A crack suddenly sounds from a lower red block on their tower, making Carol jump. Yusuf stammers that Tracy is correct, and they need to move these yellow blocks off the top right now. He and Carol hurry to do this, while Alan and Tracy scoop out as many green blocks as they can from the right box. With 1 minute 22 remaining, the blue team's green blocks are all placed on their building square, and they begin to place their yellow blocks in rows of 2 on top. However, after grabbing more yellow blocks, Terry notices the orange team copying his team's building method. He snarls and shouts that they are cheats. This alerts not only his team, but also the orange team, who continue to build their tower, although they are placing the green blocks as just 1 line of 4 blocks, instead of 2 lines of 4 blocks, like the blue team. Terry yells an inaccurate racist slur at Yusuf, adding that his sort will steal your house, your job, and even your ideas. Despite clearly sensing pain as she helps build her team's tower, Helen stops and shouts at Terry that this is a disgusting thing to say, but Sarah urges her to hurry up. Terry turns and glares at Helen, who reluctantly does as Sarah asks. With 1 minute 14 remaining, player 21 grins at the orange team's tower, then grabs a red block and tells his teammates to watch. Each of the orange team are still either focused on bringing over more blocks or building their tower, therefore they do not notice player 21 raising his arm, running to the dividing line and bowling the red block straight towards their tower. Tracy jumps in shock as the tower is hit, and Carol gasps. It leans back precariously, but does not quite fall, although some of the higher blocks come loose. Terry chuckles, "How's that?" Yusuf yells that they can't do this, and Alan asks them to stop. Terry laughs, and with a determined grin, tells player 21 to do this again. Alan and Yusuf hastily move to stand in front of the tower, and player 21 grabs another red block. Terry comments that he does not know what is more tempting, the tower or the shirtlifter's face, which causes Helen to glare towards them from behind. Carol hastily holds the tower for support, and when the timer shows 1 minute 4 remaining, player 21 runs forward with this red block. Yusuf shouts at him to stop, and to Alan's surprise, he holds back from throwing this block at the final moment. Yusuf looks up to the gallery and angrily asks if they are going to stop him, although nothing is said in return. Player 21 runs forward once more, crossing the red line by a few inches and bowling the block straight towards the orange team. Alan's face is hit and he yells in pain, gripping onto his nose as he stumbles back into the tower, which collapses beneath him. With a grin, Terry yells that he is out, then cheerily pats the back of player 21, who smiles coyly. Mr. Orange announces through the speakers how there is 1 minute remaining. Sarah briefly watches this scene, then rolls her eyes and carries on building the blue team's tower. Helen glances up to the orange team, who are now helplessly examining the remnants of their destroyed tower. She turns away and focuses on her team's tower, but almost immediately feels her head and closes her eyes. Sarah shouts over, asking why she keeps stopping. She croaks that she has a migraine, and Sarah turns back to their tower, then places down some more yellow blocks and rolls her eyes. On the orange side, Carol is trying to help up Alan, whose nose is now bleeding, and Tracy is rapidly placing the small green blocks back onto the building square. Meanwhile, Yusuf is looking ahead to the dividing line, at the spot where player 21's foot crossed when he threw the red block. He suddenly turns to his team and whispers that 21 crossed the line. Carol is the only other player on the orange team to pay Yusuf any attention, and she snaps how this is an understatement. However, Yusuf responds that this is not what he meant. He briefly explains how 21 was not stopped when he crossed the central line. Therefore, they could try to run across to the other side and break down the other team's tower. As Carol appears to process this information, Yusuf looks up to the timer and grimaces when he notices just 49 seconds remaining. He looks at the blue team's tower, which is now having the large red blocks placed on top by Sarah. Without another word, Yusuf charges across the dividing line, straight towards this tower, although Sarah instantly spots him and alerts Terry and player 21, who twist back to see him. The orange team watch Yusuf sprint ahead, but he slips on a wet stain when he tries to dodge Terry and falls to the floor with a clamouring thud. Yusuf shouts to fork off, but Terry leans down and punches his face. Yusuf gasps out in pain as Terry tells him to go back to where he came from, gesturing to the room's orange side, where Alan and Carol are now watching in horror. With 38 seconds remaining, Sarah continues placing the red blocks onto the blue team's tower. Helen drowsily goes to help with one, but instantly stops and gags. Sarah snarls and edges back, whilst Helen runs to the empty middle box and vomits inside. Sarah voices her disgust and covers her nose with her jacket, then yells at Helen to wait in the corner for the end of the game. Helen unwillingly does as she is told, while Yusuf painfully stumbles back to the orange side of the room. Terry watches in amusement as the orange team attempt to rebuild their tower. He then jokes to player 21 about their scrambled and disorganised efforts to create a base for the green blocks. Mr. Orange announces that 30 seconds remain, and player 21 looks over to see Sarah on tiptoes as she places the final red block on top of their tower. He smiles, then glances to the orange team's tower, which is starting to take some shape, despite still being much smaller than that of the blue team. After briefly muttering to himself, player 21 suggests to Terry that they cover all bases. A few seconds later, both men sprint past the dividing line. Carol shouts an alarm, and Tracy runs to cover their tower. Yusuf darts round, and player 21 tackles him to the floor, knocking his head against a yellow block. Alan tries to block Terry, although he runs ahead and punches Alan's face with such force that he trips backwards over a red block. Helen watches in a daze from the opposite corner as Carol tearfully shouts at Terry to leave Alan alone. Terry laughs at her and approaches Yusuf, whose head is now bleeding. Terry uses his foot to hold Yusuf's neck to the floor, but Tracy remains focused on adding yellow blocks onto their tower. However, when 23 seconds remain, she jolts round to see player 21 walking up behind her. Tracy grabs a red block and tries to smack it up into player 21's groin, but he jumps back and raises his eyebrows. Tracy gasps and player 21 kicks the side of her head, causing her to fall to the side. He walks forward and effortlessly kicks his other leg through the tower, severely reducing its height. Yusuf rages and finally manages to release his neck from beneath Terry's foot. He then pulls on Terry's leg, bringing him to the floor. Yusuf is about to strangle Terry when player 21 runs in from behind. He pulls Yusuf back before stomping a foot down onto his face, which makes him cough up some blood. With 18 seconds remaining, Carol bursts into tears and desperately runs towards the blue team's tower. Yet before she even crosses the dividing line, player 21 catches her. Carol screams as player 21 twists her round to face him and throttles her neck. With one hand, he practically carries her towards the double door and forces her up against it. Carol tries to beg for help, but her voice is already restrained. After she reaches out a clawed hand to player 21, he snarls in contempt, then lets go, leaving her to drop inanimmately to the floor. Terry meets player 21's eye, and with 14 seconds remaining, they saunter back to their half of the room. Sarah is carefully inspecting all sides of their tower, while Helen is still slumped against the wall. Sarah convenes with Terry and player 21 in front of the tower. Player 21 points to Helen and asks if she has actually lifted a finger, to which Sarah shakes her head. Terry does not seem to be listening, and laughs instead at Tracy's efforts to put down any block she can grab. With 12 seconds left, Alan painfully stumbles to his feet, and Helen recoils when she sees his bruised face. He turns round, and tears form in his eyes as he looks up to the nearly expired timer. Yusuf also stirs and tries to sit up, but fails. He then begins muttering a prayer to Allah, which makes Terry scoff in disbelief. Helen gulps and a tear forms in her bloodshot eye as she watches Carol cry and desperately plead to the gallery to tell her girls that their mummy loves them very much. Tracy's breathing accelerates, and she tries to add some yellow blocks, but they are now slipping off the side of the tower due to the speed at which they are being added. With 7 seconds remaining, Alan is shakily whispering the remaining number as he watches it descend on the timer. Tracy is still focused on putting any block she can on their tower, which now stands at barely 60 centimeters high. A tear falls from Helen's eye, and she inhales with a sorrowful sniff. She gulps, then wipes away her tears and lets out a vivid breath. The timer hits 3 seconds, and she charges towards her own team's tower. Terry darts around just in time to see her collide with the lowest blocks. Almost the entire structure collapses around her, leaving just a few small green blocks connected to the building square. Sarah and player 21 dart round to see Helen lying within a pile of the different coloured blocks. The timer subsequently hits 0. Terry yells, demanding to know what Helen has done. Player 21 continues to stare blankly for a few seconds until Sarah screams and runs towards her. However, before Sarah can reach Helen, the door beneath the gallery flies open, and the circle guard fires several bullets at the blue team. Sarah receives 3 bullets to the chest, and falls next to Helen within the pile of blocks. Despite being shot in the arm, Terry holds his ground, and painfully states between gasps that his team had the highest tower. He gestures to Helen, and shouts how only this bitch should be shot. Terry stumbles back, and begs the guard to wait, but before he can finish his sentence, he too is sprayed with bullets. Player 21 appears numb with shock, and slowly shakes his head, muttering how this is not right. He looks to the guard, then turns and runs to the other door, but is shot before he can take a second stride. Helen wistfully turns her head to the orange side of the room. Tracy takes shallow, panicked breaths, while Carol is still curled up with her eyes closed and hands gripped over her ears. Alan's eyes are widened with shock, and the front of his trousers is now wet. He watches in disbelief as Helen's head rises within the pile of blocks. Alan frowns at her and mouths, "Why?" Another tear falls down each of Helen's cheeks, although she manages a bittersweet smile in his direction. The guard reaches Helen, and she peacefully closes her eyes. Alan shouts at the guard to stop, but a moment later she is shot through the head and falls back into the pile of blocks. Still shaking and curled into a ball, Carol very cautiously opens her eyes and seems bewildered by what she sees. Tracy quietly turns to Yusuf, who is now lying unconscious before her. It is then announced that players 18, 19, 21, and 22 are eliminated, whilst players 23, 26, 28, and 32 have passed. That evening, when the 54 remaining players are resting in the dormitory, Square Guard conducts individual meetings with each of the Triangle Guards in the overlooking gallery. The first meeting is with Mr. Yellow, who is escorted into the gallery while Square Guard is stood at an easel in the corner, painting a copy of Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. Mr. Yellow takes a seat at the table and looks at the easel for a while, before asking if painting is Square Guard's real passion. He finishes a twirl in the painting's sky, then turns and responds that he has many real passions. Mr. Yellow gestures to the painting and jokes that Squareguard would probably rather be somewhere more interesting than this country. Yet Squareguard quickly replies how he has always liked Britain and its people. Mr. Yellow nods, and Squareguard sits down across the table. He spends most of the meeting discussing Mr. Yellow's 3 games, each of which he says went well. Mr. Yellow reflects that he could have included some more rule differences between the 3, to which Squareguard expresses agreement. He advises that Mr. Yellow should also focus on not being fazed by the other triangle guards. He subsequently explains how even though Mr. Yellow's face cannot be seen, he seems intimidated by the others, especially Mr. Orange. Mr. Yellow jokes how Squareguard would also feel intimidated if he knew what Mr. Orange was like. Mr. Yellow shuffles in his seat, and Squareguard stays quiet for a few seconds, before simply declaring that if you are always focusing on what others have, you will never be happy with what you have yourself. Mr. Yellow nods, and Squareguard tells him to bear this in mind during the next game. As Mr. Yellow lets out a sound of relief, Squareguard informs that he is indeed through to the next round. Squareguard reaches across the table to shake Mr. Yellow's hand, then tells him to review the brief for the next game, which will be delivered to his quarters this evening. 10 minutes later, Mr. Orange is called to enter the gallery. Squareguard spends the meeting reviewing Mr. Orange's 3 games, for which he gives a plethora of praise, claiming that as a set, they were the most engaging to watch. Mr. Orange thanks Squareguard, who adds in an ironic tone how the players of these games also seem to be having the most fun. Mr. Orange laughs, until Squareguard suddenly asks why he and the other Triangle Guards did not allow the players to choose their own teams for these games. Mr. Orange seems lost for words, and Squareguard claims to be baffled that none of the Triangle Guards thought of this. He adds how he would have expected Mr. Orange to be the one to make this suggestion, which would have made for a more dynamic series of games. Mr. Orange responds that he will bear this in mind and not let Squareguard down in future. He begins to say what else he will do when Squareguard interrupts that he does not need to worry, as he is through to the next round. Mr. Orange lets out a cheerful laugh, then gives Squareguard a bone-crushing handshake. He promises he will not disappoint, and Squareguard nods quietly. A few minutes later, Squareguard approaches a chest of drawers by the screen and takes out a VHS tape labelled in Korean as Game 1, Red Light, Green Light, from the second Korean Games, which took place in the summer. He puts the tape into a VHS machine beneath the screen and watches the game for the next few minutes, until a knock is heard on the door. He lets the tape play until there are 28 seconds remaining of the game, at which point the screen is showing player 46 of these games, a pretty young woman with dark silky hair, who has stood just 12 meters before the finish line. When the large doll statue begins singing once more, Squareguard pauses the tape and calls in the knocker. Mrs. Blue enters, but before she can sit down, Squareguard points to the screen and asks what she would do if she were player 46. Whilst walking to the table and taking her seat, Mrs. Blue observes the events on the screen, before finally answering that she would go slowly and take long, steady strides to the finish line. Squareguard unpauses the tape, and player 46 steps out a leg, when the doll statue almost immediately stops singing. Player 46 freezes, with widened eyes and a leg in the air. However, several players throughout the lane do not stop moving in time, and are subsequently shot. This includes player 55, a slightly chubby middle-aged man, who is stood directly behind player 46. He collapses forwards into player 46, which causes her to lose her balance. She gasps as she trips forward and is shot before she hits the ground. Squareguard turns off the screen and tells Mrs. Blue how she was correct about going slowly, as 28 seconds was more than enough time for this player to cover the remaining distance. Squareguard continues, however, that he wanted to show this to Mrs. Blue, as a way to remind her how easily our plans can be destroyed through the actions of others, even when they do not wish to do so. Mrs. Blue simply nods and thanks Squareguard. He spends the next few minutes reviewing her 3 games, which he describes as the most organised, with the lowest overall total of rule breaks. Mrs. Blue says little in response, until she is asked about who she is most apprehensive to work with. She instantly replies that this would be Mr. Orange, and goes into greater detail, but Squareguard eventually interrupts how he is thinking of placing them together in the next game. Mrs. Blue asks if this means she is still in the running, and Squareguard responds that she is. Within a minute, he shakes her hand and dismisses her from the gallery. The next meeting is with Miss Green. Squareguard takes an elastic band and forms a cat's cradle as he watches her enter the room and sit down across the table. She looks around, and a silence ensues, until she nervously asks if he has had a nice day. Squareguard responds that he is having some trouble figuring her out, and feels like there is something she is hiding, especially after her last game. Yet she retorts how she is having trouble understanding him as well. Squareguard asks what Miss Green means, and she asks why he is not in charge of these games. He curiously rotates his head, and she explains that if he is interviewing them for this position, he must surely have the experience to run these games by himself. Squareguard leans towards Miss Green, and she moves her gloved hands along her legs to her knees. After a few seconds, he asks if she has ever been in trouble for asking too many questions. She asks in return if he always answers a question with a question. Following a brief silence, Miss Green apologizes, claiming that she talks a lot when she's nervous. Squareguard waits a little longer, before laughing aloud and revealing how he does the same. Miss Green chuckles lightly, and Squareguard relaxes his body, then states how he did ask to be placed in charge of these games, but the powers that be decided differently. He continues that hopefully something senior will be waiting for him back in Korea's next games. Miss Green looks ready to ask something in return when Squareguard declares how surprised he is by her light-hearted attitude right now, given how badly her first 2 games went. Miss Green retreats in her chair, and Squareguard informs that of the 5 triangle guards, her set of games featured the most rule breaks. Before she can respond, Squareguard claims how in her first game, players had no clue what they were supposed to be doing, and he has never seen a car crash like this, not even in the Russian games earlier this year. Miss Green grips her nails into the sides of her legs, as Squareguard adds that he has also never seen players defy a guard of her rank and live to tell the tale. She quickly explains how she became overwhelmed in this second game, yet Squareguard asks why she included so many rules, especially when many of them were not needed. Miss Green cracks her knuckles against her knees and begins to breathe deeper, but responds that she was really trying to take on board his advice from her first game. Squareguard is about to speak, when Miss Green asks if her third game did not show how well she is able to listen to feedback. Squareguard stammers and waits, before admitting that her third game was very well balanced. Miss Green looks up as he explains how the rule about each player only being allowed to touch one colour block made for a very entertaining game. Squareguard continues that if Miss Green can channel this kind of innovation into any future game, it would be enough to put her through to the next round. Miss Green nervously exhales, and Squareguard asks if she understands, to which she nods rapidly. She utters that this was just a bad day, and asks Squareguard if he has not ever had one. He seems somewhat taken aback by this question, but after composing himself, replies how he has had many a bad day, although he would make sure he is having a good day if he is in a process like this. Miss Green gulps, and pleads that she will continue to listen and learn. To her apparent surprise, Squareguard raises his hand and declares he has heard enough. Miss Green leans forward in her chair as Squareguard looks over some notes and hesitantly informs that he is struggling, as he is not sure if she will be able to cope with future games, especially when she has to work with the other guards. Miss Green frantically replies how she still has more to show, but Squareguard holds his hand up and repeats that he doesn't want to hear any more of her pleas. Miss Green falls silent and grips her hands into her knees. After a few seconds, Squareguard lets out a deep breath, then with an unwilling undertone, announces that he will give her the benefit of the doubt for today, and declares she is through to the next round. Miss Green lets out an enormous sigh of relief, causing her chest to descend visibly beneath her dark blue jumpsuit. She then tells Squareguard that he will not regret this, but he points to one of the cameras on the wall and claims how they will be the judge of this. Soon after, Miss Green leaves, and Squareguard emits a brief laugh. He pours himself a drink, then heads to the window and looks over the activity within the dormitory below. After a while, he speaks into his radio, claiming to be ready. A minute later, a knocking is heard at the door, and Squareguard tells this person to come in. Miss Purple does so confidently, and wishes him a good afternoon as she sits down across the table. Squareguard asks how she is, to which she cheerily replies that she is well. He then asks how she thinks her games went, and after a pensive sigh, she answers, "Pretty good." Squareguard nods and agrees, explaining that each of Miss Purple's games featured aspects which future candidates could learn from. He adds, however, that even though her games were well controlled, she can afford to take her foot off the accelerator sometimes, and even more of a back seat along the way. Although Miss Purple's face is covered, her posture shows confusion. Squaregod then explains that there is in fact nothing wrong with letting the players show their true colours. Miss Purple slowly nods in understanding, and Squaregod clarifies how too little control in a game is chaotic, but too much can be boring, and hence contrary to the spirit of the Squid Game. Miss Purple nods, and Squaregod initially stays quiet. Miss Purple seems to wait for him to say something, until he declares that this is why he has chosen to eliminate her. Miss Purple turns her head at an angle, but when Squaregod does not move, she laughs in surprise and asks, "What?" Squaregod removes a box from a drawer of the table, and Miss Purple shouts with a hint of amusement that this must be some kind of a mistake. Squaregod opens the box and takes out several black and white photographs of Yusuf's friend, Issa, and his new friend, Alison, together in a garage, walking along a street, and entering a pub in Bradford. Miss Purple falters and wipes her hands against her legs as a photograph is shown of Yusuf being dragged into the van outside this pub. She leans back and asks who this is, but Squaregod simply asks her why she felt the need to meddle with this player outside the games. She stutters for a few seconds that she has no idea what Squaregod is talking about, although he interrupts to not bother lying. The pair look straight to each other, and the only sound heard between them for the next 10 seconds are shallow breaths, until Squaregod points up to the camera behind him, and Miss Purple grunts with displeasure. She fumbles for a few seconds, then audibly snarls and exclaims how this one needed to pay for the way he disrespected her before the vote. Squaregod watches quietly as Miss Purple claims that 28 pushed her onto a bed and threatened her, which left her feeling shaken up. Yet within 30 seconds, she is begging for forgiveness, claiming to realise now how much of a mistake this was. Squaregod soon tells Miss Purple to be quiet, and informs that these games thrive on fairness and freedom of choice, including the choice of players to risk returning. He then explains how these are real people with real lives, whether they are rich or poor. Whilst Miss Purple's breathing quickens beneath her mask, Squaregod recalls that someone once told him how those with too much money and those with no money at all have remarkably similar lives, devoid of joy. Therefore, these players should be treated with the same dignity and respect which would be afforded even to the powers that be. Miss Purple tries to interject, but Squaregod declares that she has clearly misunderstood the ethos of these games and will therefore be leaving the games immediately. She gasps in anguish and claws her gloved hands, then reaches into her jumpsuit and pulls out a knife. She jumps from the chair and slashes the knife across the table before Squaregod. He jolts back and narrowly avoids the blade. Miss Purple swears and clambers onto the table, but Squaregod takes a few steps back towards the window and reaches into his pocket. Miss Purple curses him and begins staggering forwards, when Squaregod takes out a pistol and fires at her chest. She falters and moves her hand towards the bullet wound, then another shot is fired into her chest. Miss Purple falls back across the table and slips off onto the floor. Squaregod strolls round as her arms start shaking violently against a chair leg. He watches for a few seconds before shooting another bullet through her head, terminating any remaining movement in her body. A few seconds later, the door to the gallery flies open, and several circle guards hurry in with guns at the ready. One of them asks why Squaregod did not give them the signal, but he shows his pistol and responds that he was prepared. Whilst he, Miss Purple, and the room itself are inspected, one of the guards looks into the dormitory, where players continue to rest and chat amongst themselves. This guard asks how the players did not just hear the gunshot. Squaregod calmly responds that the glass is soundproof, and they paid extra to ensure players were unable to hear anything they should not. A stretcher is subsequently brought in, and whilst Miss Purple's body is lifted, another guard asks Squaregod if he can see now why they had some reservations with his plan to do the interviews without them present. He admits that he sees their point, but wanted to find out the real reasons for Miss Purple's trip to Bradford, without her feeling any pressure to edit her words. The guards check Squaregod's safety and he thanks them, but asks to be left in peace. As the stretcher carrying Miss Purple's body is removed from the gallery, Squaregod takes out some marbles from the desk. He walks over to the window, and for the next few minutes, swirls them around in his hand, and watches the activity in the dormitory below. A few minutes later, most players continue to relax and socialise. Player 54, the old religious man with rosacea, finishes praying by the side of his bed, then finishes off his bottle of water and lies down within his bed. For the next minute, Squaregod watches player 16, the mousy young woman with delicate glasses, as she braids the hair of player 17, the old Geordie woman, until a scream sounds a few rows behind these women. Many players look over to see player 54 convulsing violently within his bed and frothing at the mouth. Player 53, a middle-aged woman with a blonde quiff and chunky glasses, jumps up from the adjacent bed and calls for help as she grabs onto player 54.